What's going on, guys? So today we're going to be tackling something again on the same Jeep that we've been working on for a while now. As you guys know, we got the gas tank back in, we've got our springs, our rough country 2.5-inch lift kit is installed, our frame is completely done. We went ahead and threw a little bit of a patch over here where there was a big hole in the body. It's just kind of to seal things up. Not really perfect, and I'm not a body guy by any means. I don't even attempt it, but we did need to seal that giant hole up there. We got the new exhaust on, we got the skid plate back in, and if you guys notice, the skid plate that was right here is missing. And the reason being is when you lift these things, this drive shaft comes down too far and it hits that skid plate. So you do have to come up with a solution for that if you want to run the skid plate. But this Jeep is not going to be an off-road Jeep. It hits the beach every now and then, but other than that, not really off-road. So not a huge deal. And then, yeah, we got the front lift all done. That's in and ready to go. We just need to get this thing on the ground so we can reconnect our sway bar links, and then we'll be good there. But today, what we're going to be doing is actually fixing these leaks. So we see we got a massive pinion seal leak here, and then up front as well, our pinion seal is completely toasted and everything is soaked with gear oil. So we're going to show you guys how to do pinion seals on these things, which is not hard. Really not hard at all. A couple little tips and tricks, but nothing insane. We're going to start by pulling the drive shaft. Then we're going to remove this yoke. We'll pop the old seal out, pop the new seal in, and the tips and tricks will come to when you're reinstalling this yoke, so that you don't seriously mess something up. Same thing goes with the front. But I'm going to set you guys up on the tripod. We're going to start by getting this drive shaft out of here, and then we can pull the yoke. All right, so we're going to start by pulling the straps off for the U-joints, and 3 of the bolts we can get to with power. Be super careful with these because they have a tendency to break. So just use your judgment. If they start coming out really, really hard, stop. And a lot of times you can resolve your issues with a little bit of heat. But I think we're gonna have to get that top one with a wrench, which is no big deal. Yeah, every now and then we gotta do it like we used to in the old days. And these bolts are 8mm or 5/16, whichever you have handy. Do not use an open end wrench on these because you will strip them out. And of course, when you're filming it, it takes 3.5 hours and 437 turns to get the bolt out. Any other time, it's fine. All right. All right, now that we got the straps off, you're gonna need a pry bar or something to get these to unseat. You don't need much pressure, but when you do start pulling this thing out, hold on to these caps on the U-joint because they will and can fall out of there and you'll be in a world of hurt. And so being that you don't want these U-joint caps to fall out of here, what we're gonna do is a little trick that I learned from my father a bunch of years ago, is these little caps are full of needle bearings, and if they come off of there, you have the potential that those needle bearings are all gonna fall out, or they're not gonna go back in right, or the caps are gonna go on wrong. So what we do take a little of the old electrical tape and just run it around here a couple times. And that will hold our caps in place so that as we're hammering on this yoke trying to get it off, we're not going to have an issue. And you don't have to take this drive shaft completely out. You can literally just kind of stick it up on top of the exhaust and it should stay. So now you want to kind of get a feel for how this yoke feels in here. If it's super loose, then you're going to need to replace the bearings as well, which gets into a whole nother category of work that we're not going to be doing today. But there's a little bit of preload on that bearing, and you want to kind of give it a turn to figure it out. Now there's an actual spec, and I'll list it right at the bottom of the screen here because I got to look it up. But there's an actual spec that you use with a torque wrench, and that torque wrench determines how much force it takes to spin this. And how much force it takes to spin this ends up being the preload that you put on the bearing. So we're not going to do that. And I'll explain why in a couple of minutes. I'm going to get this all cleaned up so that we can work on it without getting crap down in the diff. And then we'll come back. Okay, so before we get started in pulling this thing apart, let's explain what's going on here. Because I know you guys like explanations. You can hear my dog up there trying to figure out what I'm doing and who I'm talking to. But what you've got is this is the pinion shaft, and the pinion shaft runs down and intersects with the ring gear, which is on this angle. So you have one gear that runs solid that way and a gear that runs sideways this way and transmits power to your axle. So when you turn this, your axles turn. Now, there's a tapered roller bearing right about here, and there's another tapered roller bearing at the back. The cones are facing in on this one and out on this one. So what happens is as you tighten down the nut for the yoke, it pulls the pinion in and pulls the yoke down, therefore tightening the two tapered roller bearings. As those two tapered roller bearings tighten in their races, you start to get resistance in here, and that's called preload. Now you want a certain amount of resistance because when it gets cold outside, when all this stuff cools down completely, you do not want this thing flopping around in there because you do have a gear meshing with another gear, and you need that mesh to be very consistent. So now you don't want too much preload on this to where it's too tight, because when it's too tight, you're going to build a lot of heat in the bearings and you're ultimately going to smoke your bearings within the first 100 miles that you drive this thing. So it's kind of a fine line. Now the way that they set that particular preload is right in and about here. There's a sleeve, and that sleeve is made out of a very strong steel, and it's a crush sleeve. So as you tighten this nut, that sleeve crushes a little bit more, crushes a little bit more, crushes a little bit more until you reach your preload. Once you've reached your preload, you stop tightening and you're good to go. So there's no actual torque spec for this. The spec is rotational force. Whatever force it takes torque-wise, and again, I'll put it down in the bottom, is what you're going to set your preload to. The way we're going to do this is because we're not replacing this crush sleeve. We have a vehicle that's got almost 100,000 miles on it. Our preload right now is very loose, so we can afford to take up a little bit more preload. So what we are going to do is, one, we're going to mark the nut and the shaft so that we can get an idea of where we're about to be, and then we're going to go literally about 1/8 to 1/4 of a turn further just to tighten up the preload a hair, and I'll show you more of that once we start getting things moving. So let's get this giant nut off of the yoke. We'll get the yoke off, and then we'll show you the seal. All right, we got super lucky in the fact that this nut came right off, and now you can see how loose this is. So basically, we took all that preload away from those bearings, and now we can just yank the yoke off. And we're also too going to take a little bit of time, and we're going to clean up this journal right here and make sure that we don't have too much of a groove in there from the seal riding on it, which we don't. So we're going to clean it up with probably some Scotch-Brite just to make sure that we're good. And we're going to go ahead and pop this seal out now. Went around that with a nice sharp chisel, and if we're lucky, it should just pop right out. There we go. And there is the old seal. And now's a good time too. You can kind of get in here, clean out all the old RTV that they put on the seal. Get any dirt and grime out of there. Trying to make sure nothing makes it down into the diff. Let's see if I can get a little better angle on that for you. So there's your outer bearing. And that's the cone bearing on the front that feeds right into here. So now that we've got all this cleaned up, and go ahead and pop in our new seal, which I should have somewhere. Okay, so I'll get you guys a little bit up close and personal here. These new seals actually have a built-in sealing ring around the edge here, so you do not need to use RTV on these. You can literally just kind of punch them in there and they'll be good to go. These are actual Spicer seals. I wouldn't recommend anything else other than Spicer because everything else leaks. So this is a really nice seal. So now what we're gonna do is no RTV. We're gonna get it in there and we're gonna tap it very gently just to get it seated. You'll be able to feel when it gets seated. And then we're just going to continue to tap this very, very gently all the way around until we get it completely seated. You hear the difference in the tone? All right, so that seal is now fully seated. It's really that easy. We went ahead and cleaned up the yoke with some red Scotch-Brite, just super quick. And you guys can see that line that's about midway through there. That line is where the seal has been riding the entire time. And you want to make sure that that groove isn't too significant, because if that groove is too deep, what's going to happen is your new seal is going to ride in that exact same spot and it's just going to leak like a sieve. So you always want to feel to make sure that that groove isn't too significant, and this one's actually not too bad. So you can't catch it with your fingernail, and if you can't catch it with a fingernail, it's usually going to be good because the seal can compensate for the rest of it. So now we're just going to go ahead and slide this on nice and easy, and it does help to kind of rotate things a little bit, just to make sure you're not pinching that seal in any way. And now we can put our nut back on. Use a little WD, just kind of lube things up a hair. And now this is where experience comes into play. I've done so many of these that I know exactly where to stop. But if you're unfamiliar with it, then I would by all means use the torque spec. So we're just going to buzz this on until it's tight. All right, so now I can feel there's a very little bit of resistance. There's no in and out play. So we'll go a little bit more. All right, a little bit more resistance. So we'll go a little bit more. Right there, it's perfect. So now I can feel some resistance in that, which means that we've set our preload pretty close to where it was, but not too tight. So it feels pretty good. It's rotating fine. Rotate it a few times. And our preload is great. It's just a little tiny bit, probably 2 or 3 inch-pounds tighter than it was, which takes up the slack for the used bearings. So we're good. That's it. That's all it takes to do the rear pinion seal on these things. Really not a big deal, and not even really time consuming. You know, it should take about a half an hour to do this. If you're on your back, maybe an hour total, but pretty easy job. So now we're gonna move on to the front. All right, so now we're at the front one, and it's gonna be pretty much identical to the rear. We're gonna start by removing yield drive shaft, which, oof, do not cross thread, and do not strip the heads of these bolts out. There's that side. Don't lose the bolts either. All right, get the other side. All right, and then we'll grab the pry bar, pop the U-joint out. And same thing on this drive shaft. Tape these up so that you don't lose them. And then I like to just kind of just set the drive shaft on the control arm bolt, and it's nice and out of your way. And now we can go ahead and remove this nut and pull the yoke. And we got lucky again, which is awesome. See if we get lucky with the yoke. Might have to tap that off. The front ones get a little bit ornery sometimes, and you just have to kind of come in behind and now guys, I am not hitting that hard at all. So before y'all freak out and say that I'm ruining the bearings by tapping on that, I am not. I've done it that way for 20 years. So now we got the yoke off, nice and dirty. We'll do the same thing again. We'll get a little chisel in behind here and get this big seal out. If I can find where I put my chisel. There we go. And we're not actually moving the seal out of the bore by doing this, but we are freeing it up from the edges so that we can get something in there and pop it out. So that's when I usually take my handy dandy screwdriver here. And that one doesn't fit. So go with the next best thing. And this one. Or you can use a small screwdriver like so. Poke a hole in it. And then pull that way. Sometimes you'll get it. And that time we weren't too lucky. We'll keep trying. There we go. it's moving. Gonna be stubborn. I can be stubborn too. And yes, they make a tool for this, but too cheap to buy it. There we go. There's that seal. Now, just like we did before, we're gonna clean that out. Make sure there's none of that there debris. Make sure everything down inside there looks good. And in this one, you can't see the bearing because there's this huge washer here. You just want to make sure. Now, these axles are a little bit different, and we'll explain that at the end of the video, but some of these Dana 30s didn't have a crush sleeve. Some of them used bearing shimming to do it, but most of them have a crush sleeve in them, so they're very similar to the rear. And this one is crush sleeve. So we're gonna go ahead and tap this seal in. Same thing as before, a legitimate Spicer OEM Dana seal. Also in the same thing before, built-in sealant all the way around this edge. So we can literally just plop this in here and get ourselves started as soon as we find our hammer. There it is. You'll feel it when it starts because it gets very difficult very quick, and then you just want to make sure that you're tapping it in there nice and straight and that you're not hitting it real hard. Take your time. You can hear how the sound changes. And you do not want to hit this thing with all your might, because ultimately that outer lip is going to bend significantly if you start really hammering on this thing. All right, so that seal is in. Now, same as we did before, we're going to go clean the yoke up with some emery cloth. All right, so this one's all nice and cleaned up now. Again, there's the seal groove right in the middle. Doesn't feel too bad. Has a little bit in it, but nothing major. So we'll go ahead, we'll pop this on. We'll tap it in place because it did come off a little bit harder than normal, so. And let me stress, do not hammer the crap out of this thing back on, because you will effectively smash the pinion into the ring gear, or you'll start pushing this thing out of its bearings, and not going to be a good time. Not going to be a good time at all. So we'll tap it on just enough to where we can get the washer and the nut started. Here's the washer. And get the nut on there. And then we're going to use the nut to pull the yoke the rest of the way onto the pinion. We're not going to continue hammering on that thing. So now again, we're just going to go until this thing seats, which is right there. And we're going to feel it. Now I do have a little bit of resistance there, so I'm going to go just a hair more. Feeling pretty good there, a little tiny bit more. Perfect. And there we go. So now our new seal is in place. We have good preload on this diff. Last thing to do is just reinstall the drive shaft, check the fluid levels because these things have been leaking forever, and our pinion seals are done. Done. All right, so our pinion seals are now both done. And as you guys can see, it's really not that difficult of a job. You can even do it on the ground. I mean, it's obviously easier to do it up on a lift, but doing it on the ground is really not a big deal. To do both of them, you're looking at 2 hours max. And with it being a Jeep, you can get right underneath them. You probably wouldn't even have to jack the thing up. Just make sure your wheels are chocked and it's not going to roll anywhere, because that could get uncomfortable quick. But like I was saying to you guys earlier, there are two different types of pinion preloads depending on what axles you're using. And the two different types are mainly crush sleeve versus shims. Now with a crush sleeve, it's nice because you set your pinion depth, you put your pinion in, you put your front bearing in, put your yoke on, and you tighten the thing until the pinion sleeve crushes to the proper depth and it sets your preload. You don't have to worry about it. The only bad part about that is technically every time you take one of those apart, every time you take the yoke off, you're supposed to install a new crush sleeve, which means that you basically end up tearing apart the entire rear differential just to replace that crush sleeve. Now, luckily, if you're not replacing bearings, that crush sleeve will be fine because it'll take up any wear that has happened on those bearings over, 80 or 100,000 miles. The other type is shimmed. And what those do is it literally, the pinion has a collar built into it that the front bearing rests against, and you shim off of that. So what you're doing is taking this front bearing that's right at the yoke, and you're either moving it out or you're moving it in, and you tighten everything up and you set the preload. Now what's nice about those is that the shims never go bad, they don't crush, and if you start getting excess slop, you can literally just pull a shim out and tighten things back down again, and you're good to go. They're also nice in the fact that you could take the yoke off 600 times and not have to worry about ruining that crush sleeve and having to take apart the whole differential. However, initial setup is much more difficult because now you're putting in a shim, you tighten it down, your preload's too tight. You take it back apart, you put in another shim, same thing, and you go through that process over and over and over again until you get the preload correct. Whereas with a crush sleeve, you go easy, 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 easy. When you reach your torque measurement, you're good. That's it, you're done. You don't have to do anything. If you go too far though, you do have to pull the whole thing apart and put a new crush sleeve in it. So each one of them has their benefits, each one of them has their drawbacks. I personally don't mind either way. I've been setting up axles for years, and whether it be Jeep axles, Dana axles, or it be General Motors axles or Ford axles, it doesn't really matter. They're all pretty much the same. And they all have their difficulties, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses just like anything else. But really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I've been trying to give you guys more detailed videos on what we're doing and how we're doing it, and hopefully it's well received. The videos are going to be a lot longer than normal, so if you're patient and you can deal with me talking a whole lot, then awesome. Thank you so much. But we're going to get to doing, oh God, what do I have left on this thing? I got to reconnect the fuel lines. I got to put the wheels and tires back on it. We got to do the front brakes. We got to shoot some rust reformer on some of these areas. And then a couple little things on the interior. We got to put some speakers in it and just make it happy again. So it plays music. But we're almost done with this one. And this one's been a big project. Started out with the frame being a whole lot worse than we thought it was going to be. Got that taken care of, and then it's just been little things here and there that have been, you know, kind of killing us here. So almost done with this one. Almost done with this one, and it's going to be amazing when it's all set. So again, guys, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you very much. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, make sure you go down and whack that subscribe button for me. It really helps out with the channel. And we'll see you guys all in the next one. Who knows what it might be. All right. Have a good night, guys.